Exodus through Numbers is a bit difficult to understand for several reasons, one of which is the arrangement of the material. There is a historical flow of events unfolding, but that gets broken up frequently with Sinai covenant legislation in differing amounts that is often repetitious. So we will first follow the flow of events, as Moses led a generation of Hebrews out of Egypt to Mount Sinai, then 40 years of wandering because they refused to enter Canaan, until the next generation was camped on the plains of Moab across the Jordan River from Jericho. Then we will take a topical look at the Sinai covenant, meant to regulate Israel's national life in Canaan until the Messiah arrived to begin the final, international part of God's larger redemption program. Last, we will look at Deuteronomy with Joshua, as these two books referred to the second generation of Hebrews who grew up during the 40 years of wilderness wandering and then followed Joshua into Canaan. As Genesis closed, the 7-year famine had devastated Egypt, during which Joseph had moved the rest of his family to Egypt around 1876 BC and settled them in the Nile Delta region called Goshen. Thus, a total of 70 Hebrews were in Egypt. Joseph did a tremendous job of preparing for and then administering food supplies during the famine so that the people survived. Joseph reminded his brothers that the 400 years in another land, foretold by God to Abraham in Genesis 15, had begun, after which God would move them out of Egypt and back to Canaan. Over 300 years later, we arrive at Exodus chapter 1. So, why does Exodus open with a Pharaoh who does not remember Joseph and views numerous Semitic Hebrews in Goshen as a threat? Well, there were some big changes in Egypt during the interim, between the end of Genesis and the opening of Exodus. Between 1730 and 1550 BC, Lower Egypt, lower in elevation, the Nile runs downhill to the north, had been invaded and ruled by Semites, the Hyksos or shepherd kings. Because they had entered Egypt through the northeast area near Goshen, when they were expelled by the native Egyptian 18th dynasty, it is only natural that they would be suspicious of a large population of Semites, the Hebrews in Goshen, that could aid another wave of Semitic invaders. That's why steps were taken to decrease the number of potential male fighters. Hard work, then kill boy babies. The Hebrew midwives chose to not kill the boy babies, and it was into this setting that Moses was born. Moses was threatened in infancy and came out of Egypt like the later messianic prophet like Moses. In Exodus chapter 2, 1 through 9, Moses was probably born around 1526 BC, as the 400 years were coming to a close. God providentially protected and prepared the one he would use to move the Hebrews out of Egypt and into Canaan. When it became impossible to hide baby Moses any longer, he was placed in a floating basket, and his older sister Miriam put the basket in the reeds near where Pharaoh's daughter would come to bathe in the Nile. Pharaoh's daughter recognized him as a Hebrew baby, but felt pity on him, and Miriam came out of hiding and asked if she wanted her to find a Hebrew woman to nurse him, which would of course be his real mother, who would now be paid to nurse him under the protection of Pharaoh's daughter. That is God's providence at work. In Exodus 2:10, we're told that Moses was later adopted as the son of Pharaoh's daughter, and the name she gave him, Moses, fit his origin, drawn out of the water, his future task to draw Israel out of Egypt, and was very similar to the names of pharaohs of that era, Thutmoses, Ahmoses, and so on. God's preparation of Moses, part 1, was growing up in Pharaoh's house, where he was given the best Egyptian education, became a man powerful in words and deeds, and understood Egyptian royalty and culture. In verses 11 through 15, after 40 years in Pharaoh's house, killing an Egyptian to protect a Hebrew created an opportunity for the new Pharaoh, perhaps a brother of the daughter who raised him, to get rid of the adopted Hebrew he had grown up with. When he tried to intervene in an argument between two Hebrews, he found they did not want his help, so he fled far away to Midian. In verses 15 through 22, Moses then began part 2 of God's preparation for his future task. In Midian, he connected with Jethro, married one of his daughters, Zipporah, a child was born, and Moses settled down to the peaceful pastoral life, herding sheep for the next 40 years. Already well educated and familiar with Egyptian royalty, becoming familiar with the Sinai wilderness and learning to lead easily frightened critters completed his training. In verses 23 through 25, when the 400 years predicted to Abraham were nearing completion, God called Moses on the burning bush phone to the task he had been preparing him for. At the burning bush, the messenger of Yahweh spoke to Moses, which then was Yahweh or God speaking directly. This deserves some discussion. The Hebrew and Greek words translated into English as angel masks the fact that the word simply meant messenger, and not necessarily a created angelic being. Adam and Eve heard God walking in Eden, and he spoke to them. God came to Abraham in a man-like form and spoke with him. The messenger of Yahweh was revealed to be a divine figure that had God's name in himself, could forgive sins, and would accompany Israel from Egypt to Canaan. Moses and the elders saw him at Mount Sinai. He stood in the way of Balaam, and he met with Joshua before the conquest of Jericho. And there, note the similar remove your sandals and holy ground comment. The messenger of Yahweh during the Judges era called and encouraged Gideon, then met with Samson's parents. He met with the prophet Elijah, struck down the Assyrian army threatening Jerusalem. He spoke with the prophet Zechariah and Mary's husband, Joseph. Later, Jesus identified himself as the I Am, who had wanted to gather and protect Israel. And Paul later identified the divine being that dealt with Moses and Israel in the Exodus, wandering and conquest of Canaan, as the pre-incarnate Word, Jesus. Next, we need to understand Moses' reluctance to return to Egypt. Having already been rejected trying to help the Hebrews in Egypt, with a Pharaoh who wanted to kill him, and now happy in his peaceful life in Midian, it's easy to understand why Moses really did not want to return to Egypt. Have you ever been somewhere that people did not treat you very well, or tried to help people and were rejected by them? You're probably not eager to do that again either. Well, he didn't realize that God had been protecting and preparing him for this task during his previous 80 years. So he tried some excuses to see if God would let him out of it. Have you ever offered God excuses to avoid what you know he wants of you? Excuse number 1 comes in Exodus 3, 11 and 12. Well, who am I? I'm nobody special. Well, actually, Moses was special, and he had been well prepared for the task God has called him to. 40 years in Pharaoh's house, and 40 years herding sheep near Mount Sinai. But rather than read his resume, God just told Moses, I will be with you. After you leave Egypt, bring the people to this mountain. Excuse number 2 comes in Exodus 3, 13 to 22. Well, what if the Israelites ask your name? What do I tell them? Tell them, I am sent you. You and the elders are to go to Pharaoh and request release to sacrifice, but he will be stubborn, and I will have to twist his arm to free you. But I will humble him, he will let you go, and the Egyptians will give the people wealth as they leave. Excuse number 3 comes in chapter 4, 1 through 9. Well, what if they don't believe you sent me? Well, then you show them these signs. Your staff will become a serpent, probably a crocodile, then a staff again. Your hand will become leprous and then clean. Then pour Nile water on the ground, and it will turn into blood. Excuse number 4 comes in verses 10 through 12. Well, I've never been eloquent. Well, you can tell God is getting upset because he responded, I made your mouth, you are going, and I will teach you what to say. In Egypt, Moses had been well educated and had been a man powerful in words and deeds. Now, he's probably lost some confidence, but he is not hesitant to try and talk God out of sending him. The real problem comes out next. Excuse number 5 comes in verses 13 to 17. Moses said, send somebody else. And now God is mad because he has spent 80 years protecting and preparing Moses for this, and he is the best man for the job. His brother Aaron and God's power-packed staff are going with him. And then God took care of other possible excuses. In 4:18, his father-in-law approved the trip. In 4:19, the Pharaoh who wanted him dead is now himself dead. In verses 20 through 23, Moses, family, and God's staff start for Egypt, and God summarized the task. Confront Pharaoh, show the signs. Pharaoh won't give in right away, but he will be humbled, and he will let you go. In verses 24 through 26, the showdown over circumcision is really pretty simple. The earlier covenant of circumcision, Genesis 17, 9-14, was still in effect and would continue to be during the entire Mosaic era. This was not just Moses, but that whole generation did not circumcise their sons, and Joshua would have to deal with it before the second generation could proceed with the conquest. But how could Moses lead Israel into covenant obedience at Sinai if he will not obey the existing circumcision covenant in his own family? Zipporah had probably been frustrated that Moses would not comply, and it had now created a life-threatening situation for Moses. So she took care of it and expressed her anger at him. It apparently created a rift between Moses and Zipporah, and he sent her away back to Jethro, which was why they were reunited when Moses arrived at the mountain with the Israelites. Moses had a stubborn streak in him because Zipporah was right on this one and saved his life. In verses 27 to 31, Moses and Aaron showed the signs to the Hebrews in Egypt, and they accepted him as their deliverer, until the next problem, when they will gripe at him.
I was able to interview the Pharaoh this morning about all the bad plagues that are devastating Egypt, seemingly associated with the Hebrews and their God, wanting them released. I asked him about that, and why he did not just let them go.
Simple, I need storage cities, and they won't build themselves. If I let the Hebrews slaves leave, the Egyptians would have to do the work, and since the Great Famine struck many years ago, everyone just expects continual government handouts.
This is Celia Hotep for Cairo Action News.
So why was Pharaoh so stubborn? Well, he was the living god of Egypt, and gods don't take orders from lowly Hebrews. He needed the Semitic slave labor to build store cities, to supply the garrisons protecting Egypt's northeast border. When Pharaoh said the Hebrews had to get their own straw, which released a chemical binding agent in the clay that made the bricks harder, the Hebrews griped at Pharaoh, then Moses, and then Moses turned around and griped at God. Well, remember, Moses did not want this assignment. The plagues were the compelling force that would make Pharaoh release the Hebrews and reveal the gods of Egypt were unreal, while the Hebrews' God was and is the real deal. Pharaoh's magicians realized it first. Then some of the Egyptians also began listening to Moses. In 1238, when the Hebrews left Egypt, a mixed multitude left with them. There were some Egyptian people who got the message and wanted to follow the true God. The plagues revealed the emptiness of Egypt's nature gods and goddesses, as God declared that, against all the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgments. Moses' staff becoming a serpent that ate the serpents produced by the magicians was a direct insult to the god Sepik, who took the form of a crocodile. The Nile turning to blood and fish dying revealed the impotence of Khnum, guardian of the Nile's sources, Hapi, spirit of the Nile, Neith, god protecting larger fish, and Hathor, who protected the smaller fish. Frogs out of control was a direct assault on the goddess Heket. Gnats, or mosquitoes, and swarms of insects that were blood-sucking dogflies, or ichneumon flies, produced skin irritations that rendered the priesthoods impure and revealed the powerlessness of the god Uachit. Plague on cattle struck at the sacred Apis bull and god Ptah. Boils on men and livestock not only rendered the priesthood unclean, but also demonstrated the powerlessness of the lion-headed goddess Sekhmet, as well as Serapis, the deity of healing, and Imhotep, the god of medicine and healing sciences. Burning hail and lightning and locusts destroyed the flax and barley crops, revealing the powerlessness of the deities protecting agriculture, Nut, Isis, and Seth. 3 days of darkness was a direct assault on the sun gods Ra and Horus. Hardening Pharaoh's heart began with his own human stubbornness and ended with God taking over for his own purposes. Along the way, the magicians realized that this was the finger of God, and they warned Pharaoh. He admitted his own sin on 2 occasions, and he offered several compromises. Perhaps there is a lesson here for us. Do not refuse him who is speaking too many times, or the opportunity for repentance might be lost. And Paul may have been thinking about this in 2 Timothy 2:25. When God decides to make you an example to others, as he did with Pharaoh, you are in serious trouble. Pharaoh hardened his own heart in most of the first 7 plagues. At 7:13, after Moses' staff became a serpent. At 7:22, after Nile River water turned to blood. At 8:15, after the magicians copied the plague of frogs but could not remove them. At 8:19, after the gnats caused the magicians to recognize the finger of God. At 8:32, after the swarms of insects. At 9:7, after the plague on livestock. At 9:12, God hardened Pharaoh with the boils on people and cattle. At 9:34, Pharaoh again hardened his own heart with the burning hail, thunder, and lightning. At 10:20, God hardened Pharaoh after the locusts, and at 10:27, after the 3 days of darkness. With the warning about the death of the firstborn, God again hardened Pharaoh's heart. With the death of the firstborn coming, in Exodus 12, Israel was told to mark their doors with lamb's blood and remain inside their houses. The lamb's blood covering their houses was the only difference between Hebrews and Egyptians. In Exodus 12:29 and 30, we have a description of the death of the firstborn. Then Pharaoh told them to go, and as predicted, the Hebrews received a lot of wealth from the Egyptians and took off. A mixed multitude, including some Egyptians, left Egypt with the Hebrews. The Hebrews had been in the land of Egypt for 430 years. Exodus 12:37-41 tells us that after 430 years, the Hebrews and others with them left Egypt and traveled from Ramses to Succoth. In Exodus 13:17-22, we find that they carried Joseph's bones with them as he had earlier requested. They were led by the messenger of Yahweh in the cloud and fire pillar. God did not lead them around the Mediterranean shoreline towards Canaan, but towards the Yam Suph, literally the Reed Sea. After departing, God hardened Pharaoh's heart again to chase after the Hebrews, and Pharaoh's army caught up to them with their backs to water deep enough to drown in. A strong wind pushed back the water. The Hebrews crossed the Yam Suph on dry ground, with walls of water on either side. And when Pharaoh's troops followed, God let the water go back to its natural condition, and Pharaoh's army drowned. The location of the Yam Suph Crossing and Mount Sinai are disputed, mostly because the location of places cited has been lost over time. The traditional view is that Israel crossed the Yam Suph west and then traveled down the west side of the Sinai Peninsula to Jebel Musa. The newer alternative view is that the Hebrews traveled south or east across the Sinai and then crossed the eastern arm of the Yam Suph at one of two possible locations, then met God at Jebel al-Lawz in Midian or modern Arabia. To my mind, the problem with the traditional view is that if Israel traveled down the west side of the Sinai, why would the Amalekites attack them so far from their own land? The problem with the alternative view is that it appears the Yam Suph crossing occurred fairly soon after they left Egypt, but the eastern arm is over 100 miles away. Paul said that Mount Sinai was in Arabia, but in Paul's time, Rome considered the Sinai to be a part of Arabia. We do know that the journey from Goshen to Mount Sinai took 3 months. In Exodus 15:22-25, they encountered bitter water at Marah, but a tree sweetened the water. Perhaps a typological lesson, for the cross brings sweetness to life's bitterness. In chapter 16, griping about the lack of food, God miraculously provided manna, literally, what is it? And providentially provided meat. Rather than appreciate what they did have to eat, the Hebrews kept comparing manna to the menu they had in Egypt. It was only meant to be temporary until they entered Canaan, but they wound up eating manna for 40 years in the wilderness because they refused to enter Canaan. In Exodus 17:1-7, again complaining about the lack of water, God stood on the rock and told Moses to strike the rock with his staff, and water was provided. It will be the struck and wounded Jesus who will later provide the Holy Spirit, the living water of eternal life. In verses 8-13, the Amalekites from southern Canaan attacked Israel before they arrived at Sinai. This battle provided another typological picture pointing ahead to Jesus. Joshua led those who, like us, have to fight their individual battles in the valley of this world. But the overall course of the larger conflict was determined by God's man on a hill, between two others, with his arms outstretched on a piece of wood. In verse 16, because of this unprovoked attack, God determined to eventually eradicate the Amalekites. In Exodus 18, after 3 months' travel, Moses and the Hebrews arrived at Sinai, and he was reunited with his family. Jethro noticed that Moses was worn out from long hours spent judging all the people's conflicts, so he advised selecting mature and responsible men who could handle the smaller issues, leaving the more serious matters to Moses. Yes, there were workaholics and individuals who thought themselves the only ones authorized or capable back then also. In Exodus 19, God gave Moses a summary of the covenant he wanted to make with Israel. Moses delivered it to the elders, and they agreed to be God's people and keep the covenant with him.